Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 84, Ozbek and the Knyazes. We speculated last time about how Yuri might have persuaded Ozbek to give him the Yarlik of Vladimir, a knyazhestvo to which he had no legitimate claim. Later writers wondered whether he had somehow bribed the Khan. Some historians have argued that Moscow's weakness made him attractive to Ozbek and his divide and rule strategy. Whatever the story was, he did not keep the Yarlik for long. Once again, we're in a situation where much is omitted and unexplained in the chronicles, and different cities give us different and sometimes contradictory narratives. But the outline goes like this. In 1320, Yuri's brother Ivan visited the Horde, spending a couple of years there and, as some historians argue, lobbying against his brother. This claim rather rests on what happens with Ivan later on, and reading back from there to suggest that maybe there was some behind-the-scenes manoeuvring to explain events that are otherwise hard to explain. We do not have any actual evidence. In 1321, conflict arose again between Yuri and Dmitry of Tver, with some arguing that Yuri was attempting to impose himself as the sole intermediary for collecting tribute for the Khan, while Dmitry defended his right to collect and deliver his own tribute, the key issue here being maintaining that personal relationship with the Khan that has come to be the foundation of any Knyaz's power and influence. Presumably, as a result of this dispute, the tribute payment is delayed. This causes concern in Sarai, and Ozbek sends an envoy named Gayan-Char to Kashin, a town in the Knyazhestvo of Tver, to collect the unpaid tribute, with the chronicles being clear that this was to be done by violence. Gayan-Char summons Yuri and orders him to attack Tver. Dmitry of Tver and his brothers raise an army to defend themselves. But before the forces can meet in battle, the Bishop of Tver intervenes and negotiates a settlement. Under the agreement, Dmitry pays Yuri 2,000 rubles, compensation for the unpaid tribute. But rather than deliver this tribute to the Khan, Yuri takes it and heads straight off to Novgorod. We're given no explanation for this action. Meanwhile, Dmitry travels to the Horde, presumably to inform the Khan that Yuri has taken the money and run, and receives a Yarlik to rule in Vladimir from Ozbek. Yuri spends the next 3 years stuck in Novgorod with the Khan's tribute, ignoring any demands to travel to the Mongols. When he finally decides that he should go, Dmitry is already there waiting for him. The Tverians waylay Yuri on the edge of the camp and kill him. A year later, Ozbek executes Dmitry for this crime. Now, obviously, this is rather a strange story, Some parts really demand an explanation, especially why Yuri would have taken the Khan's tribute and retired to Novgorod instead of delivering it and continuing to rule in Vladimir with Mongol backing. But we're not given any. With Dmitri and Yuri dead, Dmitri's brother Alexander takes over in Tver and receives the Yarlik to rule in Vladimir, while Ivan Danilovich, recently returned from his long stay with the Mongols, takes the throne of Moscow. We also get no explanation as to why Ozbek chooses Alexander. While he could have been angry at Yuri not delivering the tribute, and therefore opposed to Moscow, he had also executed Dmitri, so it would not appear that there was much to choose between them. According to the Tver Chronicle, the devil then inspired godless Tartars to poison the mind of their lawless Tsar, Ozbek, and persuade him that Mongol rule in Rus would remain vulnerable as long as Alexander and the other Knyazes lived. So Ozbek sends Chol Khan on what the chronicle describes as a mission to attack Christians, kill their Knyazes, and forcibly convert them to Islam. When he reaches Tver, Chol Khan kicks Alexander out of his palace and begins oppressing the people. One day, a deacon named Dudko is watering his donkey in the square. A Mongol seizes it. Dudko calls for aid and triggers a riot, in which all the Mongols in the city are killed. Only those who are outside the walls looking after the horses escape. The Mongols send a punitive mission led by Voivoda Fyodorchuk, a Slavic name but a Muslim in Mongol service. Alexander, who had advised the people not to rebel and rejected responsibility for the uprising, flees first to Novgorod, where he's not welcomed, and then to Pskov, where he becomes their knyaz. There's some variety across the chronicles. The Trinity Chronicle includes Fyodorchuk's expedition, but not the Tver uprising. Here, Fyodorchuk and Ivan of Moscow are ordered by the Khan to plunder Tver and lay waste to the whole Knyazhestvo. According to the Novgorod Fourth Chronicle, Alexander started the riot because he was out to avenge his father and brother. This chronicle tells us that Chol Khan wanted to sit in Tver, sit in Rus parlance, meaning to rule, and to force the people to convert to Islam. The devil inspires the other Knyazes to follow the orders of the Khan. Ivan of Moscow decries Alexander causing Christians to suffer at the hands of the Mongols by his foolhardy attempt at vengeance. Alexander defends himself, stating that the Mongols had already plundered Tver, and he was only trying to protect the life and property of his Christian subjects. To spare them further suffering, he flees to Pskov. The Pskov Chronicle also sees Chol Khan as wanting to rule in Tver, and calls him the son of Duden, the earlier ravager of Rus lands. Duden was a Chinggisid, and Chol Khan appears to be a Beg, so this is unlikely. So, what's happening here? The first thing we can say is the idea that Chol Khan arrived in the north with some kind of idea of setting up his own appanage as the Bek of Tver is completely rejected by historians. The same goes for the idea that he was planning the forcible conversion of the people to Islam. Both these claims are completely inconsistent with what we know about how the horde ruled its subjects, and for the Rus in particular, the Mongols continue to rule through Knyazes, who, even where the traditional succession is breaking down, are still always drawn from the traditional ruling families. Historians also generally reject the claim that Ozbek felt threatened by Alexander, or indeed any of the other Knyazes. I think we've already seen enough of Ozbek to agree that it's highly unlikely he was losing any sleep worrying about any of the Knyazes. And, spoiler alert, Alexander will eventually be allowed to return home, which further undermines this claim. The chronicle's tale of the Mongols' harsh behaviour in Tver is accepted as plausible. Again, I think we've seen plenty of evidence so far to accept that the Mongols could treat their conquered peoples brutally at times, even if they were not the unthinking savages of stereotype. This has led some historians to claim that they were intentionally trying to provoke the people, arguing that the Mongols had lost faith in Alexander due to his father and brother's actions, and were trying to create a pretext, such as the rebellion, for removing him. The counter to this argument is that we see the Mongols remove Yarliks and execute Knyazes without any noticeable difficulty whenever it suits them. Special efforts would not have been required in that situation. Another theory is that the horde was considering another campaign against the Ilkhanids and sent a mission to Tver to gather conscripts and money. Chol Khan then overplayed his hand and provoked the riots. In this scenario, it's likely that the uprising was spontaneous, and even if Alexander had been aware of the trouble brewing, he would not have had anything to do with setting it off. It remains an interesting case. The usual charges the chroniclers make against the Mongols throughout the period of their rule involve excessive taxes or Mongols coming into Rus cities and acting like they own the place. The claim here that they were trying to eliminate the Knyazes and impose Islam is highly unusual, and it would be very surprising if this was what the contemporary people of Tver thought was actually happening. On the other hand, the chronicle's attempt to exonerate Alexander reflects once again that the Knyazes and the people were in differing positions with respect to the Mongols, and that the Knyazes ruled the people but were not of the people. The chroniclers could not imagine a scenario where the Knyaz joined with the mere common rabble to stand up to the Mongols. Following the Tver incident, in a further blow against the lateral succession system, Ozbek then gave Alexander Vasiliev of Suzdal the Yarlik to rule in Vladimir, even though his father had never sat on its throne. We know he received the Yarlik from the genealogical table of rulers in the Novgorod Chronicle, but his time on the throne was so short the Moscow chronicles don't mention it at all. Meanwhile, Ozbek summoned Alexander Mikhailovich to Sarai, presumably to give an account of the rebellion by the people of Tver. Instead, Alexander fled to Pskov, where he seized power. Ozbek's next step was to order Alexander Vasilievich and Ivan Danilovich to attack Alexander Mikhailovich in Pskov. However, at this time they were not provided with Mongol supporting troops for the campaign. Not wanting to get into a fight without Mongol backing, Ivan comes up with a better idea. If you recall, we've already had a couple of incidents where the Metropolitan threatened warring Knyazes with excommunication if they did not reach an agreement. Now, the Metropolitan, friendly to Moscow as we heard last time, turned this threat to reality, excommunicating Alexander Mikhailovich and the residents of Pskov. Alexander Mikhailovich was left with no choice. The people of Pskov could not tolerate a knyaz who placed them at risk of damnation. So, to lift the excommunication of the people, he abandoned the throne and fled to Lithuania. In 1331, Alexander Vasilievich of Suzdal died, and Ozbek, who's clearly no longer taking any account of the lateral succession ladder, appointed Ivan of Moscow to rule Vladimir. Tver is not completely out of the running for leading Knyazes just yet, but the uprising and punitive expedition have had a serious impact, and we should no longer consider Tver to be the strongest of the northeastern Knyazes. Elsewhere in the horde, Ozbek continued his reforms. Khan Irzan of the Blue Horde proved to be an important ally in promoting Islam. He sponsored the construction of madrasas, mosques, and Sufi centers throughout the Sir Darya. He worked with Ozbek to increase connections between the already Muslim-dominated territories he controlled, the Bulgar cities in the north, and the nomadic areas in between. Ozbek gave Muslim leaders the same Tarkhan status that the Orthodox Church had already received. This enabled a rapid increase in missionary work and school building, and the Muslim community swiftly gained prominence, wealth, and influence. More Muslims meant more power for Ozbek. He combined the traditional position of a Mongol leader with a new sense of being the spiritual father of the Muslims among his people. Having already restored Batuid dominance of the Blue Horde in the east, he now turned his attention to the west. Toktor had already broken the power of Nogai's Danubian horde, but this did not yet mean that central control had been firmly established in the west, which had had a high degree of independence since the initial conquests. Toktor had already ended Nogai's line. The eldest son, Cheke, had fled the collapse of the horde to his brother-in-law, Tsar Theodore Sviatoslav of Bulgaria. In 1300, Toktor had ordered the Bulgarian Tsar to kill Cheke, and despite being his brother-in-law and ally, Theodore had done it. Then Toktor ordered the Bulgarians to conquer the Black Tatars of the Bujak steppe, a mix of Kipchaks and Mongols who had broken away from the remnants of Nogai's horde. Again, Theodore carried out his orders. As these orders showed, the horde considered Bulgaria to be part of its territory. During Ozbek's rule, the horde attacked the Byzantines 5 times, with campaigns moving out of Bulgarian territory. And Ozbek authorized Theodore to expand his territory south at the expense of the Byzantines, but also north into what had previously been some of Nogai's domain. As this was territory that had belonged to one of the Jochids, this made it clear that the Bulgarians were seen as subjects, not allies. Theodore and the next Tsar, George III, took over Dobruja and Bujak and ended any attempts by followers of Nogai to re-establish an independent horde in the west. One outcome of this was that Ozbek no longer had any tasks for the Bulgarians. When George Terter died, the new Tsar, Michael Shishman, had ambitions to establish a new dynasty, but Ozbek preferred increasing his personal control in the west. After the failed campaigns against Hungary, the Mongols still regarded them with hostility and were concerned by any attempts to extend their influence eastward back into the steppe, especially as Hungary was still home to large numbers of Cumans, who had avoided the Mongol mission to unite all of the world's nomads. Since the destruction of Nogai's horde, Hungary had been claiming territory that the Mongols had formerly ruled. Part of this territory was held by a Hungarian vassal named Basarab. The name is certainly Turkic, although we do not know whether he was of Cuman or Pecheneg origins. Basarab switched allegiance to the Mongols, paying tribute and agreeing to hold the Jochid frontier against Hungary in exchange for Mongol protection and patronage. Over the next few years, tension slowly ratcheted up as Charles I of Hungary declared Basarab disloyal and attempted to reimpose his authority. In 1330, the Hungarians invaded, quickly capturing the fortress of Severin. Basarab offered submission and a payment of 7,000 marks in silver, but Charles rejected the proposal against the advice of his councillors and continued the campaign. Basarab and his army retreated into the Carpathian Mountains, and the Hungarians pursued them. The Hungarians were inadequately prepared and lacked supplies. Lost, and with their condition worsening, they agreed with Basarab to abandon the campaign if he would provide them with guides back to Hungary. Instead, Basarab's guides led them into a ravine at Pasada. Trapped, the Hungarians were slaughtered. Charles swapped clothes with a servant who was killed and barely managed to escape. This victory led to the emergence of a new independent principality of Romania, or Wallachia, formed from the core of Nogai's old territory. It already had strong trade routes and a good level of economic development, and the Romanians built on that foundation. The term Vlach, from which Wallachia was derived, was used by Slavic and German speakers to refer to the speakers of the Eastern Romance family of languages, namely the now extinct Dalmatian language, spoken in what is now Croatia, and Romanian, Aromanian, Megleno-Romanian, and Istro-Romanian. The Byzantines also borrowed the term into Greek. The root goes back to the same old German word that gave us Wales and Walloon. The Vlachs did not use the term themselves, They called themselves Ruman, Raman, Aman, or Raman, words that you can easily see derive from Roman. As you would expect from a territory that had been chosen as home ground by one of the Mongol hordes, this was an ideal domain for a pastoralist lifestyle, and the Vlachs were strongly associated with keeping sheep. The word for shepherd in the language of several neighbouring peoples derives from the term Vlach. In the Viennese Illuminated Chronicle, a Hungarian chronicle that gives us a contemporary account of the Battle of Posada, Charles rejects Basarab's offer of peace with disparaging remarks about him being just a shepherd, to be dragged out of his house and beaten like any shepherd or cowherd. Wallachia became the first independent Romanian principality, and Basarab acquired the name of Basarab the Founder. His descendants, including Vlad Dracula, will rule for the next 2 centuries. He also gives his name later to Bessarabia, a mainly Romanian-speaking region, mainly lying in what is now Moldova, but including part of Ukraine's Chernivtsi Oblast, that will become part of the Russian Empire in the peace that settles the Russian-Turkish War in 1816. Thus, as we can see, Ozbek was not only focused on the core horde territories or his religious policy, he took an active personal interest and intervened effectively in the furthest border regions of his realm, securing central control and unity as the horde enters the period of its greatest wealth and power. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.